Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to my medieval sewing party because we aren't going to get to do a medieval buzz today. Could you bring me the microphones? Yeah. So I hope we get people back after that disaster of a live stream and the failure of technology. This is definitely one of the very good reasons that I do medieval living history and not why I'm not particularly fond of modern technology at all. You did not. So I'm just getting set back up for what will hopefully be an actually successful medieval sewing party. For those just joining this live stream, welcome to my medieval sewing party. I am the creative Contessa, and we have just had a rough hour fighting with technology. No,
No.
it does not. Oh. And we're still fighting with technology. So here we go. This is great. I love technology. So, no, I really so do not. I just did. Are we back? Fucking hell. Do you say I'm gone? On. That's great. I need more tea, please. I maybe need tea with whiskey in at this point. Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to my medieval sewing party. This is no longer a medieval buzz with Philip because technology has failed us utterly. So Philip will hopefully be back on next Wednesday with us. And we will once more be discussing the hot goss in the medieval world. No, technology failed us utterly, everyone. So Philip's going to go and enjoy his day and not have to fight with it. And we'll just continue our discussion where we left off. We'll pick it up next Wednesday, no problem. Turns out that I'm only allowed to actually interact with you all directly today. It's been a gremlin-filled morning. So yeah, where is everyone watching from? Jim, it's lovely to see you back. What are my what are my top two favorite PG-13 movies? I don't pay attention to the ratings on movies, so I wouldn't be able to tell you. I don't, yeah, I don't even have favorite movies in my mind because I don't think about programming in that way. I don't even have favorite movies that I regularly go back to. I can tell you that my favorite movies are unlikely to be medieval movies, though, because medieval movies are garbage and have inauthentic clothing, inauthentic depictions of people, inauthentic depictions of the environment, of the homes, interior spaces, of the kinds of objects that people have, inaccurate depictions of armor and weapons, inaccurate. It's just a series of inaccuracies. So yeah, I don't. People always ask me for recommendations on medieval movies in terms of clothing and costuming. And to be frank, most of the medieval movies that I've seen are utter excrement, whereas a lot of fantasy movies do a much better job of capturing medieval clothing and hairstyles and interior spaces and even arms and armor. Sad but true. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that the sentiment, Jim. I do. I appreciate that you'd be willing to share it with me. I actually don't care very much for spirits, honestly. It's not my thing. I think probably one of my favorite fermented beverages is probably actually sake. I do love a good sake. I prefer, though, as of course one should, I prefer to enjoy it with some lovely sushi. Yeah, Como Kane. I don't really think about movies in terms of favorites. So I couldn't answer that off the top of my head, but I can tell you what not to watch. I can tell you don't watch the show Decameron on Netflix if you care at all about medieval culture or history. Don't watch, Excalibur if you care at all about medieval culture, arms and armor, clothing, etc. Don't watch the Duel has a lot of real garbage in it too. Don't watch The King. Don't watch The Outlaw King. Don't watch, what else has come out recently? Braveheart. Absolutely do not watch Braveheart. It is the worst pile of historical tripe you can imagine. Yeah. Recipe for longevity. Well, based on from where? Actually, so the true recipe for longevity is to eat a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables that aren't overcooked. Eat healthy protein and healthy fats that come from animals that also had a healthy life, and stay mobile throughout the day. Don't sit. Sitting will kill you. Stay mobile throughout the day. Move around constantly. Get up and stretch regularly like a cat. You know, you don't have to. Half an hour of intensive exercise a day and 23 and a half hours of motionlessness is not a recipe for longevity. So you want lots of greens in your diet. Eat the rainbow. Avoid processed foods. Avoid artificial sweeteners. Avoid engineered foodstuffs. And get out and enjoy the fresh air. Dance. Sing. Interact with other people. Socialize, actually in person. These are all keys to longevity. How did people survive the winter in a castle in 1200? So let's start with the castle itself. People these days generally imagine that castles were drafty, frigid, damp, dark environments in which people suffered through life. Nothing could be further from the truth. This myth is derived from the fact that most castles that people visit these days are ruins and no longer in their medieval state. So they imagine bare stone walls on the inside and the outside. They imagine open windows that just let the air in. And that's not how castles were. So castles were plastered on the inside and the outside, and they were painted on the inside and the outside, believe it or not. Many of them were. And they were all plastered on the inside. Many of them were plastered on the outside and painted. Castles had wall hangings that also helped to insulate against the cold. Windows, even before they were glazing windows, meaning before windows started actually getting glass panes, they had wooden shutters, inside and exterior and interior shutters, usually 2 sets of shutters. And they would also put up, before they started glazing windows in castles, which actually is relatively late, believe it or not. But before they had glass for windows, they would cover them in hide. They would cover them sometimes in waxed hide, or oiled hide, so that the light would actually penetrate through the oiled hide, but it would still keep the cold air out. This is actually many palazzi in Florence, medieval Florence. The wealthy people's homes had waxed hide in them, or waxed vellum, so that it kept the cold air out, but it allowed the light in. So there were lots of ways that these spaces were kept warm. Even before castles had chimneys, because they all didn't, they would have a fireplace, a hearth in the center of the floor, and that heat would, radiate out from the center. And then, of course, they eventually developed fireplaces. And in some parts of Europe, wood stoves, actually, and I'm still talking the Middle Ages, that were very efficient at heating a space. And there would actually be, in most castles where winter actually happened, there would actually be a room called a solar in English, which is the room it was the heated room. It was a smaller room, so not a great hall. It was a smaller, more private space where the lord and lady of the castle and their people, to which they would retreat for socialization, to converse and drink together and play games. So it was a specific intimate space that had special heating to keep it extra warm. Of course, clothing also plays a big role in keeping warm in 1200 in Europe. So everyone wore multiple layers. I am currently wearing linen against my skin and a wool kirtle. In 1200, they would have also had a linen layer against their skin, men and women, and then most likely a wool, if you're very wealthy, maybe silk layer over top of that. And then over top of that would come a third layer of clothing, not a cloak, a garment, a tunic, and in 1200, their clothing was still pretty fitted. So in France, for instance, they were wearing something called a bliot, right? And you would wear multiple layers, and they would have head wraps to help keep their heads warm, and hoods. And they would also have cloaks. The wealthy people, at least, could have cloaks to actually help keep them warm also, which they would wear inside. And this is something it's hard for us to imagine in a lot of developed countries now, because in the winter we just crank up the heat and walk around in yoga pants and a tank top. But medieval people, to help stay warm, they would layer on the clothes. And those layers were designed so that you could still have mobility and still function on a regular basis. So those are all ways that you would be able to stay warm in a castle in 1200 in the colder parts of Europe, in the parts where winter actually happened. But the other thing you have to realize about 1200 in Europe is that it is a warming period. The Middle Ages, what actually most people call the High Middle Ages, in the High Middle Ages, there is a significant warming phase, whereby they actually start getting 2 and sometimes 3 harvests a year. And so this leads to an excess of food. There's a population boom, but it also means that the winters aren't nearly as harsh. So in 1200, they're still in the midst of that warming phase also. And some people theorize that it's this warming phase that actually leads to the Norse leaving and heading out in ships, because it melts the ice caps, right? The oceans become much more navigable in the northern parts of Europe. And so there's this it all sort of ties in. Yep. Yeah. So Amanda says, so the word solar, yes, but it also was a room that was heated, not just for the sun. Yes, you're right. The solar was a room that was oriented to maximize the sun, but it is also a room where they would actually retreat to and then, actually use the braziers to actually stay warm when it got cold. Yeah, they grew grapes in England at this time, which is an interesting phase. And castles, have you been in a reconstructed medieval castle in the winter? I have. They're not as cold as you think they are. I've actually been in a room in an original medieval castle in Germany that was reconstructed and re-outfitted as per its original 14th century state, and it's not as cold as you think it is, especially if you're wearing the right layers. But that's not to say that castles were, modernly heated. I mean, they modernly hot. They just weren't. But in 1200, it's still the warming phase. So it's maybe even warmer than it is now in the winters, possibly, depending on where you were. Oh, why castles to begin with? Why not houses? Oh, yeah. Why castles to begin with? Why not houses? That is actually a very good question. Castles start as palaces are nothing new. And palaces, of course, historically are the spaces of the powerful and the wealthy. And palaces are not just where people live. Could you bring me my snips, handsome? Palaces are not only where people live. Palaces are where the royal family lives. That's a misconception. Palaces are centers of administration. Palaces are places for ceremony and pomp and circumstance for those who are in power, right? So where's my thread? Oh dear, I just stuck that in there and I might never get it out again. Okay, so the idea of palaces date back for thousands of years. That's not a new concept. A castle specifically is a defensive structure. And, depends on how you define a castle, but the medieval castle is a response to exterior pressures that are seeking to wreak violence and pillage and plunder. And it's not just the Norse who are responsible for this. As long as there have been humans, there have been humans willing to engage in unscrupulous acts. And as long as there have been ships, there have been people willing to use ships to engage in piracy, which is an act whereby you use your ship to sail up to a place, go on land, or maybe take another ship, but you basically plunder and steal by way of a ship. That's piracy. And it could be another ship, or it could be you sailing up to a village or a monastery on a coastal town and stealing their goods. So basically, with the rise of the Norse expansion period, the Viking period, is really what leads to the development of castles in Europe, which turns, it's what makes them go from being, wooden structures on a hill surrounded by a relatively low fence, which was actually in many cases originally designed to keep the wolves out, to increasingly fortified structures as even as the Viking era, basically goes away, and the violence doesn't really stop. So castles are a defensive structure. And most medieval castles, actually medieval castles, were not giant, huge fairy tale structures like we imagine them now. But that's why castles were built, and that's why in many places castles were built on hilltops. And so that it would be a place to which you could retreat and defend yourself or your people. And in times of war, a lot of the people surrounding the castle would often retreat into the castle, so that they would be protected from the invading army. And then you have sieges. Medieval warfare was gruesome. I'm not saying warfare is always gruesome. That's a bit of an inaccuracy. Warfare is always gruesome. It's just different flavors of gruesome, I guess. Yeah, castles were built for protection, 100%. And now, of course, they're associated with fairy tales. But originally, castles were a defense structure. But, they had to be defensive, to be a place to which you can retreat. They had to have living spaces. So, and eventually those living spaces got, bigger and more grand as the decades and centuries wore on. Haas says castles started as pointy logs with long houses in the middle, and then wood structures got turned into stone because it's less likely to burn. Yeah, absolutely, Haas, 100%. But in fact, it's interesting. There's this misconception that even in the High Middle Ages, all castles were stone, and that's not true. There's actually a 13th century castle in Germany, close to where I lived, that they reconstructed it because the original did burn down. That was wood. It was a wooden castle still, even in the 13th century. And it was not built in the 6th century and then just survived as a wooden castle. It was built in the 13th century as a wooden castle. So even with stone becoming obviously the material of choice for very good reasons, there were still wooden castles in certain parts of Europe, even in the High Middle Ages. Let me see. Farquaad's castle was compensating for something. Yeah, Farquaad's castle was absolutely compensating for a little something. Oh, what's the difference between a keep and a castle? A keep is a part of the castle. So a keep, or a Bergfried in German, or a donjon in French, is the inner heart of the castle. And originally that is where the residential quarters were. It was basically a little, almost you want to maybe view it as a castle within a castle. Sort of if the walls get breached, then there's this one last line of defense. And in some cases, in some keeps I visited, the entrance to the keep is 30 feet up, and there was a set of wooden stairs that ascended to it, and those wooden stairs could be sawed off so that it would make it very hard for invaders to actually get into the keep if they breached the walls of the castle. So yeah, the keep is on the inside. It's like I said, it's like a castle within a castle. And in some keeps, that's where the kitchens were. That's where the great hall was, or the dining hall. That's where sleeping happened. Of course, depending on when and where you are in medieval Europe, there might not have been bedchambers in your castle. Everyone might have just slept in the hall, including the lord and lady. Right. But please remember, everyone, that the Middle Ages is not a monolith, that Europe is not a monolith across the Middle Ages. So your mileage is going to vary because architecture is also not monolithic. And there are different places in medieval Europe actually took a different approach to defensive architecture. For instance, in the Italian city-states, they had what I call fortified skyscrapers. For those of you who've been to Bologna, you have maybe seen 2 of them that have survived, or San Gimignano, which has a bunch of its medieval fortified skyscrapers still. So in the Italies, in these city-states, each family would basically build its own super tall tower house. And many of those tower houses had a similar entrance, like I was mentioning, where the entrance is 20 or 30 feet up with a set of wooden stairs, or even just a ladder ascending to it that would allow it to be easily defended when things got rocky, because the Italian city-states were rocky places in the Middle Ages. So, there's different, does that count as a castle? I mean, it's it's basically it's a stone defensive structure with offensive features in it, by which I mean the Palazzo Davanzati, which is still in Florence, and where you can go and get an idea of what medieval Florence was like rather than Renaissance Florence. It has murder holes on the hall, the dining hall, the public hall on the first floor. There are murder holes, 3 of them, built into the floor, so that open into the loggia below, so that if some gang came by and was getting bad ideas about what they wanted to do to the Davizi family, the family who built it, they would just pour boiling oil or other very undesirable substances through the holes. And it looks like it's a really beautiful home. And you would never look at it and think, yeah, this is a structure that's designed to, be defensive and possibly offensive in the military sense. But there it is. Oh, Big South Philly. Oh, wait. Big South Philly. Are you from South Philly? Are you from South Philly? I'm from Delaware originally. It's nice to meet someone maybe from my corner of the world. Let me see. Oh, yeah, appreciate Big South Philly. Thank you. Let me see. Is it true we lost half of all castles ever built due to dragons? It is not. No, there were no dragons. There were never dragons. But Dr. Ronald Sutton, who is a professor of history, and specifically, especially folk history, he actually did a very good talk on dragons on Gresham College's channel. Check out Gresham College. They have a fantastic YouTube channel with excellent quality lectures. And he did a lecture on the history of dragons. Ugh, I'm so frustrated by this. This knotted on itself really badly because I didn't wax it, because my wax is in the other room, because I didn't have anyone helping me set this part of the day up. So I don't have any wax. And my thread, therefore, knotted on itself. Okay, everyone, if you're doing hand sewing, you see that awful snarl there? Yeah, that's what happens if you don't wax your thread. And I didn't, because I don't have my wax. And I just wanted to keep sewing and doing the live stream, because we've had such bad luck with the live stream today. Anyway, Ronald Sutton, Dr. Sutton, has a fantastic lecture on dragons, the history of dragons. And he actually points out why there is a difference in how the West and the East fundamentally view dragons. Because in the East, in Asia, dragons are viewed as benefactors of humanity, as kind, as beneficent, as good omens, right? As something you would want in your life. Whereas in the West, in Europe, they are viewed as being sometimes synonymous with the devil. They're viewed as evil. They're viewed as something you should slay and kill. They are not viewed in a positive light. So it's interesting. He says that's because one of the theories, and this was an interesting theory, is that in Asia they have lots of very dangerous, very violent predators in their daily lives. Tigers in medieval China and Korea were still a big concern. They killed lots of people. Whereas in the West, we had some wolves, but wolves weren't, their death toll for humans was actually not really particularly high. It was mostly, the concern was about the livestock. So one of the theories is that the lack of giant man-eating predators in Europe opened up a niche for something like a dragon to fill it, right? To have the man-eating monster against which you need to defend yourself. It was an interesting theory anyway. So I can highly recommend that documentary. Oh, you're talking about the Flight of Dragons, aren't you, Michael? Yeah, about how they supposedly the way that they create fire by the hydrochloric acid in their stomach, and how when they die, that means that the hydrochloric acid just causes them to completely disintegrate. Yeah. If dragons didn't exist, why are there movies about them? There are movies about philanthropic billionaires, but that doesn't mean they're real. Oh, okay. I saw some flying dragons in the kitchen once. Too much LSD. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and Elon Musk is a real non-philanthropist. Okay. So, yeah, billionaires are real. Philanthropic ones are really not, for the most part. That's a shared hallucination. So, many of you, first off, for those just joining, welcome to my medieval sewing party. I am the creative Contessa. Some of you know me as Rachel, and I have been studying and recreating life from the Middle Ages for over 30 years. And I'm working on a hand sewing project. I'm making a 15th century Burgundian gown. And while I do that, I'm happy to answer your questions about daily life in the Middle Ages. I have particular expertise in fashion history, the history of dance, the history of food, and I do know a little bit about most other aspects of daily life in the Middle Ages because everything is interesting to me. And you can't really understand things like historical clothing unless you understand how the clothing was made. And you can't understand that unless you understand the professions that went into making clothing. So I had, I said it before and I'll say it again, I had a rather disrespectful comment, which could have been productive, but instead was just annoying, on a short video that I just recently put out talking about evidence for medieval people having both kept clean and also for medieval women having worn underwear in certain times and places. And the source that I cited is a 12th century poem that is called The Nun's Lament, although I don't think the original one actually had a title. It's written in Latin in the 12th century. And the comment basically came and challenged. I mentioned that one of the sources of evidence for women having worn medieval underwear was monastic regulations, specifically for nuns, that actually state things like how many pairs of underpants they are allowed to have. Right. And this person started off with a remark so rude as to basically make me not care about anything he said thereafter. But it did prompt me to go and find some more very interesting information about underpants in monastic communities, and how, despite the fact that maybe the Benedictine rule might have said that monks were not supposed to wear underpants, that doesn't mean that other orders within the other monastic communities didn't allow them or even regulate them to be part of the wear. And it also doesn't preclude nuns from having worn them. His argument was so flattened the Middle Ages into a monolith that it never was. And I say this all the time. Almost everything I say about the Middle Ages, the caveat is always, Europe is not a monolith. It's not a monolith now. It definitely was a monolith in any period of the Middle Ages. The 1,000 years of the medieval period is not monolithic. Yes. Oh, do we have glare?
You do.
And no one said anything until now?
Haas just did.
Haas, how are you? Haas, how are you the only one to notice that I get a haze if my phone just decides to have a greasy lens or something? I am standing while doing sewing. I'm not much of a sitter. I really don't like sitting for protracted periods of time. So I am standing and sewing 100%. So, yeah, so here is, I've found some very interesting information about underpants in the monastic communities that refute the things this gentleman was rudely saying. Now, here's the thing, everyone. I enjoy a good academic discourse. I enjoy a good academic debate if it is expressed respectfully and if it is approached from an honest, open mind to maybe have your opinion changed with new information or different information, or to have a different perspective shared on that information that you already had. This was not that kind of comment. This was just a poor little man suffering from microfallacy, who felt the need to just discount what a woman had said. Basically, that's how it read. And so let's start with some of the evidence that monastic orders did, in fact, not only wear underpants. Members of monastic orders did, in fact, wear underpants. They wore them inside of the monastery, and it was regulated that they should have them. Let's talk about some of that evidence. One, Louis the Pious, the emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, right? He actually published a a document called the Capitulare Monistacorum, which is basically a document that regulated what monks in that community could and should have. And he actually says that they are entitled to have 2 pairs of underpants. Okay, well, there's one set of regulations that says that monks are allowed to wear underpants. Let's move on, shall we? Eloise, speaking of women and underpants, Eloise of Eloise and Abelard fame, some of you may know her. She actually, after, I'm not certain if this was before or after Abelard was castrated by her angry brothers, but that's a story for another day. But I do know that at some point she wrote a letter to him, and she says in the letter, I am annoyed by these clothing regulations, these Benedictine clothing regulations, because it is clear, she says, that Saint Benedict was writing for men. They do not take into account the conditions in which women live. Because she says, and she says this specifically, she says, it makes no sense that we should not wear underpants. It makes no sense that we should wear wool against our bare skin, because it does not account for the habitual release of extraneous humors that women undergo. She's referring to a woman's period, right? Hildegard von Bingen is actually, someone actually writes her about this and asks about whether they should wear underpants in the monastic communities. And she says, yes, it's true that Saint Benedict, in the days of Saint Benedict, the monks did not wear underpants. Times have changed, and we now do. There's another regulation. Where's my little notebook? My little notebook is missing. I brought everything here with me, and in the chaos that was the first 2 attempts to live stream, my little notebook is missing. I don't even know how that's possible. I brought it back. What? Oh, right. Okay. Right. So there's this an abbot named Adelhard, writing in the 9th century. He actually says in his rules for canons, he says that they are entitled to 2 pairs of drawers also, just like Louis the Pious. Henry II, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry II, in the 12th century, donates money specifically to a monastery so that the monks can buy, yes, you heard me, underpants. They can have drawers also, right? There is a, the Cluniacs, the Cluniac monks, they actually have a special set of instructions on how to clean your underdrawers, how the monks can clean their underdrawers when they suffer staining from nightly emissions. They're not talking about nightly emissions outside of the monastery. They're talking about sleeping in their dorms, right? If they're not supposed to be wearing underpants, then why would they have instructions for how to properly clean them? Let's see. Oh, yeah. Right, there's another, yeah, and yeah, the monastic, sorry, I wrote that so badly I can't even read my own handwriting. The Capitulare, let's see, I already talked about that. Oh, Nicholas I, the Pope Nicholas I, in the 9th century. People apparently, monks, abbots, kept writing him and asking whether they should be allowed to wear underdrawers. And he gets so frustrated at the frequency with which people have written him about this that he finally says, look, whether you wear underpants or not is not a sign of holiness. If you want to wear underpants, feel free to do so. Please stop bothering me about this. Let's see. Oh, then William of Orange, Guillaume d'Orange, in the 12th century, he apparently becomes a monk. And in Le Moniage Guillaume, so this French poem about him becoming a monk, the abbot instructs him, apparently, that if he is accosted by thieves and bandits, he should not use violence to defend himself if they want to steal his habit, unless they want to take his underpants, and then he should fight back. 12th century, right? So, these are just some of the things I found, and it's not even all of them. Unfortunately, some of the notes I took We're taken standing up and writing so quickly that I can't even read my own cursive handwriting at this point. But lots of evidence about monks having worn them in the monastic communities. And then, of course, I actually provided as an example of nuns wearing underpants a 12th century poem in which a nun complains about her underpants being dirty, but apparently that was just to be dismissed out of hand. His argument that monastic communities were uniform and monolithic across the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages and across Europe is nonsense, because nothing is. Nothing is. The orders change. Different orders had different regulations on the clothing you were allowed, and they would issue ad hoc rulings about clothes that were allowed, garments that were allowed, especially as things like the Little Ice Age start happening and things start getting colder. Oh, right. There was one, I don't remember which monastic community it was. I think it was the Cluny monastic community, but there is one monastic community where the abbot says that if you want, and this one was really funny because this connects us so to the medieval era from the modern era. You all have seen these people. You are not, if you want to walk in the cloister is basically a garden that is enclosed in the center of a monastic building, and it's open in center. The courtyard is open, but there's a covered walkway all the way around the cloister. And it's a place where you can just go and walk and be contemplative and enjoy, this beautiful green space while still being sheltered from the elements. And he actually says that if you want to walk in the cloister, you have to wear clothes. You can't wear just your undershirt and your underpants. You have to put on more clothes than that. It is not sufficient to just put on your underpants and go walk in the cloister, which is like the equivalent. On cruise ships, I know many of you, this is kind of a bit of tie over to my travels with the creative Contessa. I've been to hotels. I have been on cruise ships where early in the morning at the breakfast buffet, there are people who wander down in their pajamas. And they think it's okay to just be in this public space in their pajamas. So that's the equivalent of that, right? Point is that there's plenty of evidence that not only did monks wear underpants, they wore them inside the monastic buildings, and they wore them as part of regulations or garments that they were officially allowed to have. That was the point, right? So this counter argument, blown out of the water. Sorry, buddy. Sorry. What's wrong with my PJs? Nothing's wrong with your PJs per se, but maybe if you go to a restaurant, you shouldn't be wearing them. You should not be wearing just PJs to go to a restaurant. I feel like maybe that should be a rule we all follow. But we're living in a time when standards are definitely dropping across the board. It's all just common sense we should maintain. Yeah. Where are we here? So for those of you just joining, welcome to my medieval sewing party. I am the creative Contessa. I am dressed as a 15th century noblewoman who is in the privacy of her own home, in her solar maybe, with some companions sewing and discussing the Middle Ages, daily life in the Middle Ages, etc. Handsome, did you set the subscribers only function? I can tell. I hope you only wear closed-toed shoes to a restaurant and don't have your feet out. Shoes. I don't have any open-toed shoes, so there's that. I have much less strong feelings about people wearing sandals to restaurants. But at least don't be wearing just your underpants. I mean, yeah, I guess it depends on the PJs. But wearing your bathrobe, oh, and slippers. Sorry, bathrobe and slippers to the restaurant is I don't know. I think those should be reserved for private spaces, not for public eating spaces. But that's just me. It looks like doctor handwriting. Yeah. So anyway, those are just some of the many, some pieces of the many pieces of evidence I have found attesting to the fact that medieval monks also wore underpants and that different orders of monks wore underpants, and that different monastic orders not just wore underpants, but had rules that were specific to their monastery, not even for the whole order, for their monastery. But it's foolhardy to assume that something that is done in 1100 in a monastic community is going to be done in exactly the same way in 1500. Those things change. Yeah, those things change. Let me see. Was starvation or malnutrition common among peasants? That is a very excellent question, Sarah. Yeah, no, it was not. Starvation was not common in the Middle Ages. Famines were not common. They did happen. And it, so first off, let's clear up this idea about peasants. Peasant is such a broad category of people in the Middle Ages that it's almost a useless term because it doesn't say anything about the actual economic situation or financial situation of the peasant in question. Peasant just means someone involved in agricultural work. A peasant could actually own their own farm. A peasant could work someone else's farm as a sharecropper. A peasant could be a serf. And there were very wealthy peasants in the Middle Ages, peasants who made off very well and who could afford really nice clothing and really nice food. And we know that aside from the records that have been left behind that attest to this, but there's also sumptuary laws that are written specifically because these peasants are getting wealthy enough that they can start affording the kind of clothing that their social betters, like the wealthy merchants and the nobility, can afford. So the question, was it common for peasants to starve or to be malnourished? No, it was not. In fact, peasants were probably some of the better nourished people in medieval Europe. Again, Europe is not a monolith. The 1,000 years of the Middle Ages is not monolithic. But in general, the only time people starved in medieval Europe is when there was a famine. And when there was a famine, it wasn't just the peasants who would starve. It wasn't just the people on the bottom end of the spectrum who would starve. When there was a famine, things got real dire, even towards the top. And one of the bigger famines to happen is actually the prequel to the Black Death, to the bubonic plague. So as the Little Ice Age starts, basically at the end of the 13th century, there is a summer, there's a year without a summer, basically, a couple of years without summers, where in Northern Europe, it just rains and rains and rains and rains, and all the crops rot. And it gets really, really dire. So yeah, there was starvation during that. There was malnutrition and possibly some starvation there as well, but it wasn't common. And we know it's not common because when it does happen, it gets commented on because it's not common. Peasants, people on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, actually ate a better diet than their socioeconomic superiors. By which I mean, the food they ate, being less expensive, was actually more nutritious, because in the Middle Ages, all the expensive foodstuffs were were foodstuffs that really weren't particularly nutritionally dense. So the wealthy were eating white bread made out of refined wheat flour. They weren't eating whole grain. So they were getting, and back then flour was not fortified like it is now. So there were no vitamins in it. There was no iron in it. All of that was in the bran that was sifted out. So the wealthy are eating white bread, and that white bread becomes sugar in your mouth almost the second it touches saliva. So they're eating a diet that has a lot more refined carbohydrates in it, but also fewer micronutrients. They eat a lot of meat, a lot of fish, not a lot of vegetables, not a lot of pulses. Whereas people who earned less, who had lower income people in medieval Europe, generally, again, generalization, generally ate pulses, so beans. They ate whole grain bread, not from wheat flour, because wheat flour was also the most expensive bread. So they're eating rye bread, which is also, in terms of micronutrient profile, denser than wheat, but also whole grain. They couldn't afford to sift out the bran. The bran added bulk and helped, aside from other benefits from eating bran that is part of sourdough. They also ate a lot more vegetables, a lot more greens, a lot more herbs, a lot of things that we would consider weeds now is what people on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum ate. And they did get meat, but they weren't eating meat in the quantities that the merchants, the wealthy and the powerful were eating. So it actually turns out that the poorer you were, the more nutrient dense your diet possibly was. And for the extremely poor in medieval Europe, especially in the Christian parts of Europe, the church provided massive amounts of publicly available charity for the poor. Hospitals in that era were not just places where people got medical care. Hospitals in the Middle Ages were charitable institutions where anyone could go. They could get medical care, but they were also homeless shelters, and there wasn't a limit on the time you could be there. They provided employment for people who were down on their luck, for the homeless, for orphans. They provided job training, they provided clothing, they provided food. So hospitals were pretty ubiquitous all across medieval Europe by the High Middle Ages. And so this was another way that there were actually services provided for the poor. And the wealthy the nobility were constantly donating, were constantly giving alms, were constantly giving food, were constantly donating clothing to the poor. It was part of their duty as a Christian under the old version of Christianity, where works of charity were considered the path to heaven. And in fact, most medieval people thought, especially the wealthy and the powerful, they just assumed that at the very least they were going to spend some time in purgatory. And the best way to shorten their time in purgatory was to engage in acts of charity. So yeah, the Middle Ages was not this dire time of extreme poverty that people misconstrue it as. Most of the poverty that people envisage when they think of the Middle Ages is actually the modern era. That's the Industrial Revolution. Dickens, that's not the Middle Ages, guys. That's the 19th century, and that's when things got real gruesome. That's a good question, Sarah. Thank you for asking that. I appreciate that. Yeah, so that was a good question. Were there any places in medieval Europe known for being overkill with carrying swords, even by medieval European standards? Similar to how non-Americans view Texas. I actually haven't read any primary source chronicles referring to any part of Europe as being more weapons heavy than any other part of Europe. Nothing strikes me offhand. Like, what would the medieval version of Texas be? I don't know what the medieval version of Texas would be, but almost every European country now has a part of their country that would be their version of Texas. For certain different reasons, maybe, but similar reasons. Yeah, so I can't think of any place where, people carried swords in ridiculous quantities. The reality is that carrying a sword on your person at all times is not as actually awesome as people think it is. It's not as convenient. It's not as easy to do. And the reality is that people didn't necessarily carry swords at all times. Depended on when and where in medieval Europe. It depended on your circumstances. It depended on, you as a person, whether you were a constant target for potential violence. So I think people imagine not as many people were carrying swords in medieval Europe as maybe is imagined. And it was a very specific class of society who carried swords. Peasants didn't carry swords. They didn't have swords generally. Again, Europe is not a monolith. The 1,000 years of the Middle Ages is not a monolith. Your mileage will vary. But for the most part, most people were not carrying swords. Yeah. Where do you think the rest of the world was in terms of development while Europe was medieval? So again, Middle Ages is not a monolith. Europe is not a monolith. For instance, Spain is part of Europe, and medieval Spain up until the 15th century was real advanced because of, the Al-Andalus, for instance, especially during the golden age of Al-Andalus, was an amazingly advanced place. Fantastic sanitation, paved streets, beautiful architecture, sophisticated running water, high quality medical care, very relatively peaceful place, low violent crime, very sophisticated schools of medicine and philosophy, highly educated, high level mathematics. That's also Europe. So, you can't compare Europe as a whole to any other place because Europe wasn't a single kingdom, it wasn't a single polity. Just like I can't really look, medieval. I'm in South Korea for those who don't know. And I have spent, of the last 12 years, I've spent about 9 of them here. So I know a lot, and I've studied the history of architecture and culture and art and fashion here in Korea. And what I can tell you is that Korea is not monolithic across the period that is the European Middle Ages, nor is China. There are highs and lows there. And there's different, the level of development in, say, 14th century Korea is not the same as the level of development in 14th century parts of 14th century China. So I don't know if that's really a fair question. There are parts of Europe that were certainly much less developed, and there are parts that were just as developed, if not more developed, than other parts of the world. But yeah, it depends on when and where specifically. During the Justinian plague or after the Justinian plague in Northern Europe, things were a little grim because the Justinian plagues, the Justinian plague happens starting its hottest point is the 6th century. And then it kind of recurs every 10 to 20 years for the next 150 years, continuously knocking the population down. 50% of Europe's population dies in the Justinian plague. That's not the bubonic plague, the Justiniac plague in the 6th century. And this, in Northern Europe in particular, this leads to the abandonment of settlements. Entire villages die out, entire cities die out. And so whereas before they had enough people to keep the ancient Roman infrastructure going, and it was still going, after the Justinianic plague, not anymore. And so those settlements were abandoned. Their technology broke down. Materials from ancient Roman infrastructure were recuperated and recycled into other buildings. So during that period, it gets real unsophisticated in Northern Europe. And that's just, people go from living in these beautiful ancient Roman towns with amazing infrastructure to living in villages with dirt streets and mud huts or wattle and daub huts anyway. So yeah, there is a period where it gets unsophisticated and dark-ish, relatively speaking. But it's not what people think it is, and it doesn't last for as long as people think it does. Even cities, there are cities that in 14th century England had better infrastructure and better sanitation than they did in 19th century England. It's a truth. There are cities that in medieval England actually they actually paid professional street cleaners to go through every day and scoop up any feces that animals or men usually had left behind, certainly not women, men had left behind in the night or throughout the day, and to keep things nice and clean. And those same towns by the early 19th century are so disgusting that people are dying of cholera. Cholera is not a medieval thing. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Haas, I don't really have time to be messing around with technology, but thank you. Let's see. So let me see. Were the Portuguese, they were very advanced. They had beautiful, so were the Portuguese. They were very advanced. They had beautiful cities. Yep. So the Portuguese are on the Iberian Peninsula, right? And the Portuguese also were occupied. Oh, thank you for that. Love that super chat. Appreciate that. Yeah, the necklace. So I will tell you about the necklace. Let me finish the thought about Portugal. So Portugal was also part of, the golden era of Islam on the Iberian Peninsula. And a lot of the infrastructure that made Portugal so wonderfully advanced was actually built by the Muslims as well. But, eventually the Reconquista happens and the peninsula gets taken back. But yeah, Portugal also, just like Spain in that era. Yeah, so this necklace, it's called a collar. In the original 15th century sources, it's called a collar, and it is really. This is a collar that was owned by Maria Portinari, née Baroncelli. She was a Florentine lady who married Tommaso Portinari and moved to Bruges. So she moved from Florence to Bruges. And when she got to Bruges, she was given this as a gift by her husband, we think. Could have been by Margaret of York, though. Kind of unclear. And it's depicted on her in two different portraits. Her engagement portrait when she was supposedly still a Baroncelli, and then later on in an altarpiece painted by Hugo van der Goes. That one is currently in the Uffizi. So we know that she had this for many years, and she wore it, clearly at least in two different official portraits, which meant it was probably a favorite piece of hers. It is cast out of a bunch of little pieces that are then hand enameled. So the enamel is then painted on each individual piece. It's fired, and then the stones are set as necessary, and then the pieces are assembled together manually, and then you have the final color. Right. So this is a replica of an original. It's made by Armour and Castings, and you can absolutely go on their website and purchase one. armourandcastings.com with a U, Armour and Castings. Yep, but I really appreciate that. HCAS, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah, and Haas, it's not the small screen, it's the lights. It's the lights. I can't see anything because of the lights. I couldn't see a computer screen either. It wouldn't matter. It really wouldn't. Let me see. How did people die in that pandemic? I've never heard of it. What's it called again? Yeah, right. The Justiniac plague is a bubonic plague, basically. As far as they can tell, it is the bubonic plague. It's just an earlier edition of it. It's Yersinia pestis. They actually have tested graves from England from this era, and they have found Yersinia pestis in the bones. So yeah, it's called the Justiniac plague. And it was and I think one of the reasons it's not taught about is because it was almost like historians lost sight of it. And they assumed for a long time, Victorian historians, I'm pretty certain, assumed that this Justiniac plague was just something that was suffered in Constantinople. It didn't affect any other part of Europe. And it turns out that's wrong. That's so wrong. That's so very, very wrong. And I don't know why modern history classes have not updated to teach it. I don't know why. But honestly, there's a lot of misinformation that is taught in your average high school history class that has since been debunked by many, many scholars in the field, reputed scholars. So yeah, the Justiniac plague. I only learned about it a couple of years ago myself. And I've been reading and studying medieval history since I was 5. So don't feel badly if you hadn't heard about it. It's not one that's talked about for some reason. We talk about the Black Death because that's kind of more of a more recent memory, I suppose. But the Justiniac plague was just as bad and just as far flung. Let me see. School only teaches how to be mindless people. I don't say that. I had some very good teachers in school. Although I can't speak for the education system now, I had some very good teachers in school. I had ones who taught critical thinking and who didn't always just follow the official, whatever was the official curriculum, if there was evidence that could point in a different direction. So I don't think that. Depends on the school. Again, your mileage will vary drastically. Yeah, a lot of information is outdated. Oh. Hola. Oh, am I going to say this name? El jodedor. Qué malo. Qué malo. Qué nombre. Oh my gosh. How's your day going? It's going very well. Thank you. My friend with the very sassy name in Spanish. Everything's going super well. I'm just sitting here. For those just joining, welcome to my medieval sewing party. I am the creative Contessa. I am here working on a 15th century gown that will go, the gown that will actually go over top of this one, and answering your questions about medieval history and daily life in the Middle Ages. So if you have any questions, do pop them in the live chat and I will be happy to answer them. Ideally let's try to keep it on topic, medieval life, medieval history, aspects of medieval life. So I was talking earlier about all of the interesting information I found just this morning about underpants in monastic communities in medieval Europe. And there was just some really funny passages about about medieval underpants, things I just never expected to read. I think my favorite one was that you're not allowed to wander the cloisters in just your underpants. That's not enough clothes. You have to put on more than your underpants to go wander in the cloisters. Another funny one is, you're a monk. You're supposed to turn the other cheek, as Jesus says, unless they try to steal your underpants. Then you lay down the Bible on their asses, right? Then you get Old Testament on them. That was pretty funny. The abbot didn't put it that way, but that was my interpretation of that was the tone of what the abbot was saying to this monk in advising him. If they try to roll you and take your underpants, you show them the wrath of God. Carbon dating is so problematic. That's true. When they can't date stone, they date the clay pot found within the stone. Yep, that could have been made hundreds, if not thousands of years later. Yeah, absolutely. So carbon dating is not foolproof, 100%. And it's especially not foolproof depending on the kind of flora that may have colonized the item in question. For archaeology can be really tricky because if they're dating based on the layers, if the layers are corrupted for whatever reason, if they're intrusions from other time periods, then it can throw the dating of the entire site off. So no, carbon dating is absolutely not 100% foolproof. Agree 100%. And there's some things that can't be carbon dated. So that's problematic. And carbon dating is also not necessarily as specific as some people might like it to be. Very often carbon dating will give you like 100 or 150 year window, which in the case of, say, fashion, there's a lot of things that change in 150 years. So if you're carbon dating garments, then to say, well, this garment dates to 1300 to 1450, oh, great. I need more specifics, please. Yeah. Do I live in South Korea for work? The reason why we're in South Korea, so we're technically not living here at the moment. At the moment, we are here as tourists. We are hoping to obtain gainful employment that will allow us to stay on for longer. It was originally the US military that brought us here, but we fell in love with it on our very first tour, and we've always volunteered, actively advocated to come back, in fact. So yeah, I guess you could say we're here because of work, but not at the moment. At the moment, we're hoping we will be here because of work, but we just aren't at the moment. I'm a digital nomad, so I can do my work from anywhere in the world at this point. I used to be a translator. Some people don't know that. I used to be a professional translator, and then the machines ate my career field, in fact. So there is no more translation work, not really. And certainly not in my boring European language pairs. So that's when I turned to content creation. And then the machines came for content creation, which is why I now do live streams almost uniquely with shorts that are spun off of my live streams, because, the generative AI is now starting to produce videos with such misinformation and such terrible visuals, but still. So yeah, that's what got me into the content creation as a way also to share my journey of learning and exploration, of studying, researching, and recreating medieval clothing, medieval food, medieval dance, all of that, trying to bring a little beauty to the world also, and maybe my trademark sense of humor. I don't hate modern technology, but a lot of modern technology, I don't hate technology in general. I hate certain technologies that constantly fail me and that frustrate me, and most of them have to do with live streaming. No, there's a lot of good things about modern technology. For example, I love vaccines. Love vaccines. Super vaccine fan here. My grandmother had polio when she was a little girl because that was before the polio vaccine. And I saw, what that did to her. It ultimately killed her at the early age of 71 because the hump that she got from having that contorted spine from the polio meant that all of her internal organs were crushed into a space that wasn't the right size for them. And ultimately that led to congestive heart failure and the failure of all of her organs. So yeah, if she had had the polio vaccine, she wouldn't have had polio, and her life would have been very, very different, and in many ways much more pleasant and probably longer lived. I also really love antibiotics for the right applications. No, I will not just pop antibiotics at the slightest sniffle, but If I get, for example, the bubonic plague, you better bet I'm happy to have some antibiotics. So yeah, there's a lot of things I like about modern technology. I love being able to communicate with my family across tens of thousands of miles easily, quickly, instantaneously. That is not something I could have done in the Middle Ages. I like being able to travel from Korea to Europe in 10 hours. That is definitely not something I could have done in the Middle Ages. I like having ships that can cross the ocean and not leave me feeling like a completely depleted wreck of a human being because they're so small that they're tossed around by the waves like a toy, right? So there's a lot of things I like about modern technology. There's some things I prefer about medieval ways of doing things just because it's more fun and more hands-on. For example, I love hand sewing. Much prefer it over using a machine. It's much more tactile. It's much more satisfying. I I love draping the fabric over my arm in this way, the sensation of the weight of the garment in my hand as I'm sewing it, being able to slowly witness the work, the art basically unrolling as I finish each stitch, much more satisfying than with a machine. But when I'm in a rush, do I appreciate having a machine to use? Yes, I do. So no, I do not hate modern technology in the least. There are some technologies I think need to go or be regulated, but that's not the same thing. Or am I an Orthodox Christian? No. I'm Catholic. And I'll just say that outright. I'm Catholic. I am not an Orthodox Christian. I am currently, for those who are wondering, not Amish, not Quaker, not, what else have I been called? Not a Mennonite. This is 15th century, basically the way a 15th century French or Burgundian noblewoman would have dressed in the second half of the 15th century when she is at home in her private quarters. And this is my medieval sewing party. So I have invited you all into my solar basically so we can sit and chat and play games and read stories and listen to music while some of us sew, while some of us just socialize, while other of us maybe do embroidery or do finger loop braiding, work on other kinds of crafts. Right, that's the point of the medieval sewing party. So if you're actually working on a project, let me know. Mennonite, also not Mennonite. Mennonite. Yeah, appreciate it. Te agradezco. What are you doing? Explain. Oh, Mennonite. What are Mennonites? So Amish. Many of you know the Amish community. Haas, do you know the Amish people? So they're back at the end of the 16th century, during the disaster that was the Reformation, there was a sect of Christianity, a denomination of Christianity that split off from, I don't know, probably they split off from the Calvinist church, I think, the Moravians. And they wanted to live a simpler, more ascetic life. And eventually they were not particularly well liked because of their their ascetic way of approaching things, sort of like the Swiss Puritans, I guess. Maybe you want to look at it that way. Eventually, thousands upon thousands of them immigrated to the Americas. They immigrated especially to Pennsylvania at first. And their lifestyle was one that eschewed increasingly eschewed the increasingly advanced technologies that were being developed as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. And so those are the Amish to this day. These communities, they're very insular. They adhere to this very specific sect of Christianity, and part of their entire ethos is modesty, is humbleness, is humility, and modesty in appearance especially. So the women wear very, very simple dresses that go up to their neck, not bright colors, not stripes, not patterns. The men also wear very, very simple pants, trousers, and shirts that, also go up to their neck, long sleeve shirts. And the ladies wear a little white coif, basically a little on their hair, and they don't wear jewelry. And they technically eschew using electricity and electrical appliances, but that is slowly changing. But those are the Amish communities. And the Mennonites, back before that started changing, were basically a less strict version of that, where they did actually embrace some modern technology while still following the tenets of the religious side, just actually embracing more modern technology, electricity, cars, that kind of thing. Historically, until very recently, the Amish also only drove horse and buggy. They did not use cars. Where I grew up, there were lots of Amish, not Mennonite. There were lots of Amish families. And so there were horses and buggies all over the roads, even going downtown, and especially on the country roads. And there were often, unfortunately, car accidents between the horse and buggy and the Amish. And usually the Amish didn't survive those accidents, especially between drunk drivers, unfortunately, and the buggies, the horse and buggies. Yeah, alas, alas. Yeah, well, I will tell you that if you ever, so yeah, antibiotics. No, I don't take antibiotics for just anything. I take it for very specific causes. But let me tell you, if you get a disease like the Black Plague, like the bubonic plague, like Yersinia pestis, you better hope you get antibiotics or you're going to die a terrible, terrible death. Just putting that out there. If you get sepsis, you're going to pray that you get antibiotics or you're going to die a terrible, terrible death. You know what's the number one cause of the Knights of Men at Arms in the pre-modern era? The number one cause is not death by weapon or munitions or bullets, not immediately anyway. It's actually death by sepsis, infection of your blood, which can be cured pretty easily with antibiotics. They would have killed for antibiotics in the Middle Ages, really. There's a knight, Diego de Cavanilla, whose garments actually survived in his tomb and whose garments I'm working to recreate. He was one of the last crusaders. He dies in 1482 in Otranto, which is southern Italy. And he dies because he takes an arrow to the knee. The arrow doesn't kill him. The wound doesn't kill him. He doesn't bleed out. He dies several days later of sepsis, a terrible, 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 painful bacterial infection of his blood. So antibiotics are not always bad. And in fact, there are some times where you should be very happy to have them. And there are people in developing countries who don't have access to antibiotics who wish they did. And to vaccines also, I should say. Yeah. But I don't take antibiotics for just anything. I don't believe that antibiotics have absolutely historically been overprescribed in the last couple of decades. 100%. 100%. And that's one of the reasons we have antibiotic resistance now. When I moved to Germany, I was so happy when I immigrated to Germany back in 2002 because German doctors at that point anyway would only prescribe antibiotics as a real last-ditch effort for an infection that wouldn't go away after a week or two. Like a sinus infection. I don't mean sepsis. I mean like some kind of respiratory infection or a sinus infection, right? Those kinds of flu, cold-like diseases. They would first let your body try to heal itself by just resting at home, because if you're in Germany, you get sick days. If you're sick, you're sick. You stay home, you still get paid. And so they would just tell you to stay home and rest, drink tea, especially chamomile tea, drink bone broth, just rest, let your body heal, make sure to eat fresh fruit to get vitamin C. And then if, after a week, you're still not well again, then only then would they consider giving you antibiotics. It was such an eye-opening experience. Yeah. But absolutely, I would not want to live in a pre-antibiotic world. No, thank you. I'm good. And especially if you've seen someone die from sepsis, it's horrible. It's horrible. Or seen an animal die of sepsis, which I have, by the way. I used to work in a horse stable, and I grew up with horses, actually. I'm kind of a horse-crazy person. I just can't really be so much of a horse-crazy person here in Korea because horses here are the purview of the ultra, ultra, ultra wealthy, which I'm not. Anyway, when I grew up riding and working on a horse farm, I started working on a horse farm at the age of 10. And it was a standard bred stable, and we bred, trained, and raced standard breds. And one of our champion racehorse, one day, we were grooming him in the morning, and we took his temperature every day because he was our champion. He was our breadwinner, and his temperature was a little high, and that was weird. So we called the vet because that was not normal for him. And the vet, this was when vets would actually come to the farm. The vet had a couple of other things to do. And so it was going to be a couple of hours, and we thought that was fine. But within the next hour, this poor horse's side started swelling up like a stormy sea. It was alarming. You could, like a balloon. His left flank just inflated, and he started shuddering and sweating and groaning. I mean, and when I say sweating, I mean the sweat was pouring off in literal buckets. It was horrifying. I could tell that Whippet was in such agony, and I couldn't do anything about it. Nothing. Unfortunately, the vet couldn't get there in time, so we ended up loading him into the trailer and driving him to, trying to get him to the actual nearest horse hospital, which was a 2-hour drive away for us, sadly. And so he died in agony on the way there. It's one of the most horrible things I've ever seen in my life. And there was nothing we could do because we didn't have any antibiotics. We didn't have any. Once we got him there, they did an autopsy. We wanted to be certain. Yeah, it was a bacterial infection. It was a bacterial infection. And if they'd been able to get to him in time with intravenous antibiotics, we could have gotten it under control. But yeah, so there's that. Didn't they have something like poison in their arrow, like feces or something, before they would take them to battle? Oh, poison arrows. Yeah, who was it who had the poison arrows? Oh, yes. I haven't done an in-depth study about the use of poison arrows in medieval Europe, but I can tell you one specific instance, and it has to do with the invasion, the second Muslim invasion of Spain, when the Berbers from the other side of from basically Morocco and Mauritania, specifically Mauritania, led armies north into Al-Andalus to conquer the caliphate. They brought with them Malian and other sub-Saharan African mercenaries, basically. And apparently those African, very black mercenaries, according to the original records, they brought with them hundreds of poison-tipped arrows. They were the ones who brought poison. So that is how the caliphate was conquered, by a Berber. It was the Almoravid dynasty, or I think it was the Almoravid dynasty. I'm forgetting his name offhand, but his black mercenaries, his black African mercenaries, apparently had poison-tipped arrows. I don't know what the poison was. There were different kinds of poison you can get. You could make from a variety of substances, and I haven't read that it was feces. Usually they were plant extracts. Poison was absolutely a thing. 100%. Poison was a practice in the Middle Ages. There were lots of different ways to create poison-tipped arrows. I don't think they were using feces, though. I think it was something botanical. In point of fact, feces were way too valuable as fertilizer. Let me see. In modern day, you call a rendering truck to come get a dead animal, including a horse. We buried our horses on our property. So, yes?
I think I figured it out.
Did you?
Yeah.
What are you trying to play? What are you trying to play?
Oh, shit. Now I forgot to play. I forgot the next note already.
Yeah, we buried our horses on our property. Whippet actually had a memorial. We planted trees on his grave. He was a real sweetie, especially for a stallion. He was a real sweetie. Very sad. I wrote a poem about it. Still makes me cry. That was 31 years ago, this month, actually, in May, middle of May, May 15th. Yep. Things you remember, right? Oh, yeah. So the South American were the best at poison tips. Yeah. So in South America, I'm talking about Europe specifically, right? Obviously, if you have access to poison dart frogs, then that's a game changer. That is a game changer. There are no poison dart frogs, as far as I know, or poison frogs or at least not, I'm not familiar with any poison frogs in medieval Europe. I may be wrong about that though. I have not made it an in-depth study of all the flora and fauna that were common in medieval Europe and all parts of medieval Europe for that matter. Yeah. Hark, yon minstrel is most pleasing. I do agree. And in fact, if you enjoy listening to lute music being played live, my condottiero actually does live stream lute practices on this channel. He did one yesterday or the day before, and so there's been 2 this week at least. So if you want to be notified when he goes live, make sure to click the notification bell and click on all, not personalized. So for those just joining, welcome to my medieval sewing party. I am the creative Contessa, and I am here to work on this medieval gown in particular today anyway, while discussing a wide array of topics about daily life in the Middle Ages and also answering your questions about life in the Middle Ages to the best of my ability. So let me go ahead and put this on and show you all where it's at. I still have to attach the sleeves, have to do some more stitching along the front to finish the opening. And we have to finish the hem, but I'll show you where we're at the moment. Okay, So basically, and I'll pull on the sleeves so you can get an idea of how it will look with the sleeves. But this is basically where we are at. Let's see if I can find a pin. I can pin it shut. So it's going to lace shut. There will be lacing rings on the inside of the gown that will be invisible. So it will lace completely shut. There will be no gap. No gapping. This kind of gives you an idea. Right. And this is what it looks like in the back. And it will be worn with a belt. And this is what it looks like with the sleeve on it, or with a sleeve on it at any rate. So you can get an impression of the final picture. So this gives you an idea of how it will look. It is, I've said this before, I'll say it again, it is really loose in the waist. And I've just decided I don't care because it's going to be belted. I don't feel like messing with these seams anymore to take it in the waist. And there will be a belt here that will keep it nice and tight like that. So yeah, this is what it looks like. And then there will be a pair of silk velvet cuffs or lining. There'll be silk velvet lining here on the inside, and then when I turn it back, it's golden in color, then you'll see the nice golden silk velvet. And I'm going to make a collar, a detachable collar that can also made also out of that same golden silk velvet, and there will also be gold velvet all around the bottom hem. So it'll be a band of gold velvet going all the way around the bottom of the gown. So this is where we're at right now. Yep. This is the point that we have thus far attained. We have reached. Okay, questions. Is it a mourning dress? No. Oh, that's one of those myths. Black has not always been the color of mourning. In the 15th century and the 16th century, black was the color of fashion. Why? Why was black the color of fashion? That is because black was the most expensive color. True black, especially, was the most expensive color. Not dark brown, not naturally brown black from a sheep that just happened to be brown or black. True black like this, it required multiple dye baths and it required multiple dye stuffs. So the most expensive, you would dye your wool kermes red, crimson red with kermes, which is a louse that grows on an oak tree in the Mediterranean and is almost extinct, actually. And then you do a couple of different dye baths on that to make it a nice, deep, saturated red. Then you over dye it with woad or indigo, which would make it blue, but you add to the dye bath, you add walnut shells and you add sometimes iron. And so that actually then turns it basically the tannins and the iron turn it black. They rust it black. It oxidizes to black. And that's how you get this deep color. So it's a very expensive, very involved, very scientific process, in fact. So there's a science to it. And then there's the art of controlling the temperature of the fire, and the water temperature has to be just right in an era where you're using coals and fire to heat your water, not a nice regulatable gas stove or electric burner. And so it was just a very expensive process. So black became the fashionable color in the 15th century, mostly because Charles the Bold of Burgundy, Duke of Burgundy, who was, I think, the longest reigning Duke of Burgundy ever, he loved black. And as Burgundy went, so went the rest of Europe in terms of fashion. So that's why it's black. It's not a morning dress, it's just fashionable. That's a good question. Handsome, could you please bring me a charging cable? Hello? He probably can't hear me, unfortunately. Handsome, can you bring me a charging cable? Okay, there we go. Oh, it's been a rough morning. Okay, so let me see what questions we have. Yeah, blue was the most expensive color. So, oh, no. Okay, so there's a difference between pigments and dye stuffs. Let me be clear. Dye stuff is how you make fabric a certain color. Pigments are how you make paints. Dye stuffs and pigments are not the same thing. Here. Sorry, my device is about to try to turn off. So here, turn it around and put it on it.
That won't help at all.
Yes, it will. See? See? Told you. Okay, there we go. Unfortunately, that means no more microphone, but that's just the way it's going to have to be. Yeah, so
Technology
today has just been effing with me at every single turn. Okay, so the difference between pigments and dye stuff. Pigments are used for making paint. Fabric is not painted, it's dyed. The dye stuff is mordanted. It is basically becomes one with the fiber. Pigment is something paint sits on top of the surface. So that's painting. So lapis lazuli was never used for clothing. Lapis lazuli, the video I just produced on lapis on blue, that's about painting and art, not clothing. Lapis lazuli was the most expensive pigment, 100%, no questions asked, but it was not used in fabric at all, only in painting, and not even painting fabric. Yeah. Do I have to speak louder? Usually not. The microphone on this is usually pretty good. Oh, no, it probably isn't. Okay, everyone. Well, if you've been enjoying, yeah, this is yes?
Now I got it.
Come closer. Some music interlude. No. He's trying to learn. Did any of you recognize that song? He's trying. He's trying to learn the song from the animated Robin Hood movie, with the animals. Oodaladi, oodaladi, golly day. Yeah, that's what he's trying to learn on the lute. Bardcore, yeah, Ronin Hood. What is the name of the medieval hat, extra long hooded hat that can be worn a bunch of different ways? Okay, you're talking about the chaperon. Could you get me your chaperon? I think, let me know if this is what you're talking about. We have one, if it is. Yeah. Love, love, love your necklace. Thank you. This is a replica of a collar owned and worn by Maria Portinari. And she actually wore it with a dress, a black dress, that looked very much like this one that I'm currently working on. Okay, you're talking about this? Is this the hat you're talking about? This one? It's called a chaperon in French. I actually don't know what it would have been called in 15th century English, and I don't remember what it's called. It might be a beretta in 15th century Italian, but don't hold me to that. Yeah, stylish, mostly worn only by men, but yeah, very very flexible hat. I have a short video on wearing this hat and all the different ways you can wear it. Let me see. Is there a place I can buy a necklace like this? Yes, you can. Armorandcastings.com. Have you tagged any of the Armor and Castings products by any chance? Armorandcastings.com makes this exact necklace. Armor, ARMOUR, and castings.com, one word. Maria Portinari collar is where you can find it. It is not inexpensive, guys. This is a very expensive piece. I think it's $600 currently. But you know, I've had this for 4 years and I've hauled it all over the world, and I wear it in modern formal occasions as well. When I wear evening gowns, say on a cruise on a gala night, I wear this if it's if it's got a low neckline that would actually suit this particular piece. So yes, you absolutely can get this kind of item from armorandcastings.com. And if you use the code Contessa10, one word, you'll get 10% off your purchase. Someone asked about this too?
No.
Oh.
You can show them the more Contessa bling for men.
Oh, and this is Contessa bling that also can be worn by men. 15th century men were very fond of peacocking and wearing all kinds of jewelry. So here you have an example of a replica by Armor and Castings of the kind of bling that men would wear. And this is how men look in that bling. Yeah, Stallion, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Would purple have been a possibility in the late medieval period? Would love to make some later medieval garden that color. Oh yes, purple was very common in the late medieval period. So contrary to popular belief, Murex is not the only way to make purple. That's just how you make Tyrian purple, the imperial purple. But to make purple dye in medieval Europe, there were a couple of ways. There was a lichen orchidil, I think, in Ireland that will produce purple on its own. And I think there's lichen in other parts of Europe that are similar to orchidil that will do the same. But one of the main ways to make purple was to do a red dye and a blue over dye, or blue base dye, red over dye. The red dye stuffs that were used for making red in the Middle Ages, madder is a root of a weed that looks kind of a little bit similar to Queen Anne's lace. At least the green parts do. Kermes is actually an insect, a tiny red louse that grows on a specific oak tree in the Mediterranean. That was a super expensive one. Polish lock, which is another it's a relative of the Kermes. Brazil wood was another red dye stuff. And don't let the name Brazil wood make you think that it came from Brazil. It didn't originally. Brazil wood came first, and then they called Brazil because it had wood that looked like Brazil wood, trees that look like Brazil wood. So yeah, lots of options for making red dye stuff. Some reds more true red, some more rust red, depending on the pH of the water, the temperature of the water, the amount of dye, how saturated the dye bath was. And then blue, you have many options for blue. Some of the more common options were woad. And then in the later Middle Ages, they started importing indigo in larger quantities. But at first, woad was the most common blue dye stuff. And woad is a weed. It grows most anywhere in Europe. It's a pretty common thing. So you would do a red or blue dye to start, and then over dye in the other one to create a purple. And so you could get different shades of purple, different depths of purple, depending on whether you were dyeing your fabric in the first dye bath or the exhaust dye bath, as it was called. Yep. Tyrian purple wasn't for the peasants. No, Tyrian purple has never been for anyone but the richest of the rich. Now, Tyrian purple, for those who don't know, Murex is a snail. It's a sea snail, basically. It's a shellfish. And they're not very big. Their shells are like this big. It takes 10,000 Murex to make something like an ounce of Tyrian purple dye stuff. So it was extremely laborious. It was extremely expensive. It was extremely smelly because you have to pull them out of their shell and then kill them and then let them ferment. And it was eventually, in the ancient Roman Empire, it was limited to just the members of the imperial family. And I don't remember it was one of the earlier Roman emperors who did that. And then that sort of continued in through the Eastern Roman Empire, but eventually it did come to be used by more people than just, say, the emperor and the empress, but you still kind of had to be related to the royal family. Tyrian purple production ends abruptly, though, in 1204 is the last time it was made. Those, and because it was only made in Constantinople, there was only one production factory or one set of factories that made it, and they got destroyed basically by the Franks when the Crusaders, fellow Christians, sacked Constantinople in 1204, and production never came online again. And after that, Constantinople was so impoverished that they really probably couldn't have afforded to keep it going anyway. The empire, as it were, the Roman Empire at that point had shrunk to almost just Constantinople, not quite, but it was getting perilously close to that by that point. So it never came online again, which is why we don't actually know for certain how they actually made Tyrian purple dye. We just recently, I mean, in like the last 40 years, some people have recreated it and think they have figured it out, but we don't know because the technique was never written down. It was never documented. It was a lost technology. And so we think we figured it out again, but it's something that went away. So most purple clothing in medieval Europe, almost none of it was Tyrian purple. Almost none of it was Tyrian purple. And Tyrian purple was mostly restricted to what is now Constantinople, that part of the world in the Middle Ages. There were a couple, I've heard of a couple of examples of the emperor sending Tyrian purple garments as gifts to other potentates in Europe, fellow royalty. That's why I said almost none, not none, but almost none. Very, very few garments that were purple were actually Tyrian purple, that imperial purple. Leave those snails alone. Yeah, I don't, no, thank you. I have a friend who has experimented with Murex dyeing. I mean, she did it. This was last year. She, God bless her, she did the whole fermenting process and everything. And she created a purple that was really beautiful. It was rich. I can see the allure. But darn, talk about laborious. Isn't the color purple associated with Christ? Not like you're thinking. So it came to be associated with him because he was supposed to be the king, right? And because the emperor of the world. So there were depictions of him in a Tyrian purple robe. But then in the later Middle Ages, it gets switched to blue. Just like the Virgin Mary starts being depicted in blue because lapis lazuli at that point is the most expensive pigment. And they wanted their art to reflect the most expensive materials because everyone looking at these works would know that the patron had a lot of money if everyone's wearing blue. So of course they depicted the Virgin Mary in a blue mantle. They just depicted Christ in a blue mantle. But that's not necessarily the dye stuff. That wasn't Tyrian purple. Yep. And in fact, even in mosaics, in Byzantine mosaics, he's often early Byzantine mosaics from the first millennium. He's sometimes depicted in a red mantle. He's sometimes depicted in a blue mantle. Let me see. I have some cotton curtains I picked up I'd love to use for a dress. Would you have recommendations for a simple, flattering shape? I eventually want to make something beautiful in wool in time. We're talking about modern dress, like something you can just comfortably wear about, or you're talking about historical garments. My immediate thought was an A-line tea dress, basically. A-line means it's got a fitted bodice down to the waist. There's a waist seam, or maybe even not a waist seam. There doesn't have to be a waist seam, but then the skirt flares out into a wider skirt. It's very flattering to all shapes, slender to very, round to very round, very flattering to all shapes. That would be my recommendation, is an A-line dress. And they're pretty simple to make. You can find decent patterns for them as well. But if you're talking about historical, then I need to know. I need more information. Let me see. Hello, medieval style lady. Ice Wolf Wolfie. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to my medieval sewing party. And that's why I'm wearing a dress that isn't finished yet, because I was demonstrating how the current state of this particular gown and how it looks so that you can see the progress I have been making on it. So this is where we're at. I am the creative Contessa, Madonna Contessa, some of you know me as, or Madonna Contessa. I am a medieval reenactor and practitioner of living history, and I have been studying, researching, and recreating medieval history for 32 years at this point. Yes, that seems right. 32 years at this point. And I'm here to share my learnings and discoveries with you, in this case, while working on my own projects, and of course, to answer your questions about medieval life, medieval material culture, etc.
They want to see the tapestry.
The tapestry. Okay. Tapestry lessons. Let's look at some art history, everyone. Oh, but I'm not going to be able to.
Just stand next to it. You want me to point?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Or do you
So,
want a large pointer?
so I need to stay close because I'm no longer mic'd.
Use
Right.
The lance fragment.
Use the lance fragment. Okay. This is the medieval equivalent of a laser pointer, a lance fragment from a joust. Okay. So, this tapestry is called La Dame à la Licorne. It is housed originally in the Musée de Cluny in Paris, and you can go visit it to this day. It's a series of 6. 5 of them represent the 5 senses, and 1 of them represents desire. And we know which sense this is because we can look at it and we can see that La Dame, the lady, is playing a portative organ, basically an organ that can be carried around, and it's being operated. Its bellows are being operated by her damsel. So it's air operated. So she just, drives the bellows. In this case, she's lucky. She doesn't have to tread on them. She can just use her hands. And that, fills it with air. And then she plays it. It makes the most lovely, delicate sound you can imagine, a portative organ. It's very delightful, very, very evocative. And so it's called La Dame à la Licorne because there is the unicorn on the one side supporting a heraldic lance, and on the other side there is a lion supporting another heraldic lance, and the heraldry there belongs to the French nobleman who commissioned this chambre of tapestries he probably commissioned it in the 1480s because it dates to 1490, which means it probably was commissioned in like 1480 and it took that long to make, because this chambre, this suite of tapestries, was made to actually cover an entire room, specifically as the room was shaped. So that means each of these tapestries is a different size and shape because it was meant to go in a room and fit around doors and windows and fireplaces. Which, if you ever look at medieval tapestries that are part of a grouping and wondered, well, why is that one square and that one's rectangle and that one's oblong? Because they were meant to go in different parts of a very specific room once upon a time. And I don't keep meaning to look this up. I knew at one point which of the French noblemen it was who commissioned this. I'll look it up again and I'll tell you in our next live stream. But this is his heraldry, right? This is the crescent on a blue field. That's his heraldry. That's his emblem. That's his badge, in essence. Now, these ladies, they are not dressed in fashionable attire from this era at all. They are dressed in 1490 fantasy attire. So this is costume. This is medieval costume, in essence. This lady would be recognizable to any viewer as not a real person, as an allegory. She has elements of her clothing that do reflect contemporary fashions. For instance, this gown that she's wearing with the sleeves, that was a fashionable dress. And you'll notice it's just plain fabric, relatively. It's probably a silk velvet is probably what it's supposed to be. Normal, that's fine. But this surcoat, complete fantasy. Surcoats like this were no longer fashionable at all. The slit up the front, no actual real woman has ever owned such a thing in the Middle Ages. Not in any expense account, not in any inventory, not in any death inventory, not in any portrait of a real woman is she wearing a surcoat like this, with all these extra jewels and pearls and gold and this really rich cloth of gold. So that's a fantasy gown. This hairpiece is also part fantasy, part reality. Her hair being done like this, we have no depictions of real women having their hair like that in the second half of the 15th century. But this lappet, this frontlet as it's called, that is an actual piece of headdress that women would wear as part of an entire ensemble of headdress. This was just one of many pieces that would go on the head and be layered on carefully. And you can actually see this being put on me in a getting dressed video that I have on this video under videos, not live streams, but videos. 3 years ago, almost 2.5 years ago at this point, I guess, I published a getting dressed video that shows getting dressed from the skin out in this style of clothing. And one of the layers that it goes on my headdress is a hood like this, right? But the viewer, and you can see she's got a collar, actually, that's very similar to mine, right? So there's elements of clothing that are real there, but so much of it is so over the top that any person in the 15th century would have looked at that and not thought, oh, that's Duchess so and so. They would have thought, oh, she's a fantasy. Same thing for her lady in waiting. Slits up the side, not authentic medieval clothing. No real woman dressed like that in the 15th century in France. Of course, you've got, this is called a millefleur effect, right? Welcome to art history with the Contessa. This is a millefleur effect, 1,000 flowers, basically, where you've got just all these plants in the background. Obviously, there is no real perspective here. That wasn't the goal of this tapestry series. It's just supposed to be something pretty that hangs on the walls and that conveys the subject matter, in this case, the desiring of an allegory of the five senses. But each of these flowers and plants and trees, they're all real. These aren't fantasy flowers and plants and trees. These are actually accurate depictions of real flora and fauna from the era, with the exception of the unicorn, obviously, is not real. But this was a style that came into fashion in the 15th century, the millefleur effect, where you've just got lots of flowers and plants just filling the background. Medieval people and modern historians say that medieval people had a horror, they abhorred the empty, which means they didn't like blank spaces. So they sought to fill all the spaces with detailed art like this, with what we might consider busy motifs. But in the medieval aesthetic, this was highly desirable. So yeah, that's been your lesson on ouïr, the sense of hearing from La Dame à la Licorne Tapestry chamber. Narwhals must not be real too. Yeah. Narwhals, yeah, so the unicorn horns, narwhals are real. The unicorn horns that they have from the Middle Ages are all narwhal horns, all narwhal tusks. Sorry, they're all narwhal tusks. By the way, unicorns are not by medieval standards, they are not, and originally they are not horses with horns. They are a combination of a goat and a lion. So not horses with horns at all. which is why they have cloven hooves and why they have beards. And actually their mane isn't a horse's mane, it's supposed to be a lion's mane. And the further you go back in medieval iconography, the earlier you go, when you start looking at unicorns, they look a lot more like monsters than they do like pretty white horses with horns. Yeah. Let me see. Europe and Persia clothing during medieval times. Oh goodness. Yeah. So this is specifically French. So this whole thing is a French style, right? Europe and Persian clothing during medieval times. That's the Persian Empire was pretty big in the Middle Ages, and Europe is a whole continent, and the Middle Ages is about 1,000 years. So I'm not certain what your question is. Yeah, and some people have asked why this lion has a human face, or why frequently animals in medieval art are depicted with human faces. In some cases, it's because faces are hard, and not all artists, illuminating books, especially in the Middle Ages, were actually professionals. They weren't trained artists. They weren't trained in perspective. They weren't trained in realism, and so, sometimes they would just do what they could. And so, this lion having a face like this, the reason it looks like a human face is because it's not been drawn with perspective, right? If you took these features and actually gave them exactly where they are, but just gave them the three-dimensionality of perspective, it would suddenly look just fine. It's just that basically someone looking at the lion's face drew it and then painted it and then wove it as a two-dimensional view instead of a three-dimensional view. So that's why it looks more like a human face. But it's more an issue of the medium and or the artist than the artist's skill than actually, doing it. And there's actually some theories that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans actually cheated when it came to both sculpture and realistic depictions. That in the case of sculpture, they weren't sculpting people so realistically, they were taking body casts and then doing bronze bronze pourings from real live human body casts. So they weren't sculpting anything at all, really. And that they were using something like a camera oscura to do drawings that were so realistic. So, that's a theory I have read a couple of times, and it actually kind of holds water when you start looking at the evidence. Griffin to the right. That is not, this is a lion, not a griffin. Just a lion. Just a good old lion. This is his tail. This is his mane. These are his paws. Lions were actually more common, sadly, more common in medieval Europe than they should have been, because a lot of kings had menageries in medieval Europe. They received gifts from potentates from Africa, from the Middle East, from, in some cases, Asia, with animals like lions and elephants and giraffes. So, unfortunately, they would then just kind of put them in cages in their palace as a sign of power. They were not well taken care of generally, as you can sadly imagine. So, it is actually, depending on where someone lived, they may, in Europe, medieval Europe, they may have actually gotten to see a lion, especially in London. The roaring of the lions is something that is commented on throughout the Middle Ages, because they kept, I know it wasn't the same lion, obviously, they kept getting more. Yeah. Lisa, thank you for that. Love that. Appreciate it. To the right of the lance. Right. So this is a lion, and this is a unicorn. Sorry,
it's reversed. He means to the left.
He means to the left. I'll just put it this way: lion, unicorn. No griffins here. Oh wait, are you talking about little guy? The little ones. Okay, wait, little ones. Let me see. Little guys. Looking, nothing. I don't see anything there that, none of those.
That's a sheep, I think.
Yeah, no, this is this one? This one? Do you mean this one?
No, I got a delay.
Yeah. This is a sheep. This is a fox. Bunny. Birds. No, it's a fox. It's got a big fluffy tail. Bunny. Little unicorn. Let me see. What else do we have here? Bunny. Puma or little tiny lion. It's got a cat with a lion's tail anyway. A dog that looks like a whippet or a greyhound or galgo or something. They're adjacent. Bunny. I don't know what that is. Maybe another fox. I can't see its tail. Yeah. No griffins. No griffins in this one. It's a good question though. The 1490s lady truly was that girl. Yeah, so for those who are just joining this lesson, keep in mind that these ladies are fantasy ladies. These are medieval fantasy. So the idea of fantasy art is nothing new, everyone. Humans, as long as humans have been humaning and picking up random stones and drawing things on stone on cave walls, we have had imaginations, and we have imagined things that aren't real, and we've then drawn them. Even though they're not real, we have them, we can imagine them, because that's one of the things that makes humans human, is our imagination. And so these ladies are imaginary in the sense of their clothing is fantasy. So if you ever wanted to do 15th century fantasy clothing, as a 15th century person would have imagined fantasy clothing, like if you want to do a 15th century costume ball, that is people wearing costumes, fancy dress from the 15th century, then these figures are great inspiration, but they are not useful for documenting real clothing at all, sadly. Yep. Europe had lions until the 7th century. Yes, that is true. They had their own kind of lion, and then I think they got hunted to extinction. But then they started getting them again in royal menageries as gifts. Keep in mind that this is not the 7th century. And we're back. Technology, gotta love it. The tuft at the top of her hair is most certainly his fantasy, but super cute. I mean, absolutely. Like this whole headdress thing going on is total fantasy, but it's super cute. 100% agree with you there. Yep. It's fantastic. Love it in every way. And I love that her collar is very much like my collar. Okay, everyone, can you please tell us about the existence of Persian tapestry during the medieval times in Europe? So, carpets. Carpets are I don't know much about wall hangings. If by tapestry you mean wall hanging, I don't know about the existence of Persian wall hangings in Europe, but there was a major import market for Persian carpets into medieval Europe. Oh, and in fact, we can see this here. This is a representation of an imported carpet. Now, whether it's actually from Persia or from Turkmenistan or from one of the steppes or some other Islamic place that is producing these kinds of carpets, I couldn't tell you. But it could well be, it is definitely something that was not made in Europe. They don't make these in Europe. This was an import. This was a luxury item. And what's interesting is they use them as table coverings, decorative table coverings, not for eating on. Decorative table coverings as often as they use them on the ground in medieval Europe. So a lot of the Persian rugs, or they're called, in the 17th century, they're called Turkey rugs. At that point, it was the Ottoman Empire, right? It was the big power. But these were often purchased specifically for draping over furniture, and they were an extreme luxury item. So again, I couldn't tell you whether this one is specifically supposed to be one that was from Persia or from some other beautiful rug weaving, center of rug weaving, but many of them did in fact come from what was at that time Persia, which is not necessarily the same as what is now Iran, of course. Yeah, I mean, so Solomon, first off, understand that motifs now are very different from the motifs that were being woven in the Middle Ages in Persia also. But also, when I say if it's supposed to be, this is probably not a terribly accurate representation of an actual Persian rug, because even medieval artists had even started to develop an idea of what they thought was a Persian rug, but it wasn't necessarily an accurate representation of it. Just like the representation of the lion isn't necessarily the most realistic. That's why I say whether it's supposed to be or not, I don't know. But there were rugs that were being imported from Persia. But the rugs that they were importing, they were all geometric. It was all geometric shapes. It wasn't, no swirling flora. It was all very geometric. Yeah, artistic liberties, exactly. You can't just as I would not use this to document actual clothing from 15th century France, I would not use this to document Persian carpets from 15th century Persia or even 14th century Persia, because a lot of these carpets were bought and then they were handed down over centuries because they're very well made, so they last for a long time. So this might not even be a 15th century carpet. This could be, or rug, this could be a 14th or even 13th century one. There's this beautiful glass in the V&A that was apparently made in Persia and imported, and it was beautifully enameled, and it was imported and not imported. They think it was actually brought back possibly during the Crusades, made it all the way to England, and they made a special molded leather case for it, and it just stayed in this family for centuries, and they used it. But it was well made, they treated it well, and it lasted for a long time. So yeah. Yeah. Doop-a-doo. Okay, everyone, well, it is getting late here. Yes. Okay, so I've been streaming for 3 hours, even though this live stream hasn't quite been going for 3 hours. So everyone, I would like to thank you all for joining me for today. For today's medieval sewing party, I have other live streams I will be doing over the weekend. I haven't scheduled them yet, but I promise I will. I will be doing a medieval story time, and we will be doing a medieval cooking party on Sunday in Korea, by the way, which is probably middle of the night or Saturday for most of you. And I will be exploring a medieval bean fritter recipe made with broad beans, made with fava beans, that looks super delicious. So we will be exploring the original recipe and redacting it, recreating it step by step together, and we'll see if I can produce something that's delicious and tasty, or something that we don't want to ever repeat. We'll find out. I would like to thank all of you for joining. Please double tap that screen if you've been liking, and consider subscribing. I would like to thank those of you who gave me gems and jewels and other little gifts. My super chatters today,
really appreciate you all so much. My channel members on YouTube and my patrons on Patreon and my Facebook subscribers, thank you all for supporting me in doing this work of sharing the beauty and and lessons of medieval daily life. And if you would like to consider becoming one of my supporters, patrons, channel members. It comes with a whole host of extra perks, including lots of extra footage, full tutorials that are not available to anyone else, access to my Creative Contessa Discord where we, have fun, where I share lots of extra primary source resources as I encounter them, and where we tell stories and share our own projects and ask each other questions and just generally keep on learning. Oh, thank you, Tanya, you're there. Nice to see you again, Tanya. Thank you. So, otherwise, I hope that you all have a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And until next time, may your historical explorations be creative. Bye, everyone.